Welcome to our next and final lecture from Unit 4 called From Genghis Khan to Columbus, A New Global Age. And I will take this lecture and break it up into about three parts for the video version in order to keep each of them at a rather reasonable length. But this is our last lecture then of Unit 4, tracing the third wave civilizations of the post-classical era. And we start with some of the great underappreciated actors in human history, those we sometimes call nomads. Nomads, and you'll ponder this because in spelling out the history of our species over the last semester, 16 weeks or so, we noted that for the greater part of human history, we lived not in cities, not in large organized hierarchical societies, but in forager bands, hunter-gatherers. Then about 5,000 years ago, on the heels of agricultural invention, new types of human societies that we call civilization began to form. And much of the story that we often tell in the chapters of textbooks and in the lectures of classes like this, history classes, then are the histories of civilizations in which sedentary, mostly urban peoples play a starring role. But it's not as if those who refused to settle down, as it were, those who refused even to become farmers, that they somehow disappeared from history. Those pastoral peoples who domesticated herds of animals, camels, horses, sheep, goats, you name it, cattle, the pastoral peoples of the earth, though they did not join in the urban civilizations or become agricultural farmers, they nevertheless will play, at critical points in world history, play a critical role. The story of the Mongols, writes Robert Strayer, serves as a useful corrective to the almost exclusive focus that historians often devote to agricultural peoples and their civilizations. For the Mongols and many other such peoples were pastoral nomads who disdained farming while centering their economic lives around their herds of animals. Normally, they did not construct elaborate cities, enduring empires, or monumental works of art, architecture, and written literature. Nonetheless, they left an indelible mark on the historical development of the entire Afro-Eurasian hemisphere, particularly on the agricultural civilizations with which they so often interacted. That is Strayer, your textbook author, describing the perception of and role played by those we call nomads in world history. And we find them where we look globally, often at the intersection of history, from East Africa, in the region known sometimes as the Great Lakes region of East Africa, we find the pastoral nomadic peoples known as the Maasai. To the plains of North America, and such people as the Sioux, or the Arabian Desert, and the tribal peoples known as the Bedouin. And north to the northern steppes of Asia, to the people history knows as the Turks. The worlds of Africa and Eurasia were knitted together by the interactions of urban, agricultural, and nomadic peoples. When the story traditionally has been told, it's this last group, these nomadic peoples, who are often left out of the written histories, partly because it was the sedentary urban civilizations that tended to write the histories. Whereas nomadic peoples such as the Bedouins of Arabia or the Turks of the steppes or the Sioux of the northern plains, they told their histories all right, but they told their stories in oral fashion, not writing them down typically, and thus preserving them only in their internal traditions of storytelling, not necessarily for the larger world. But scholars of the modern age have been diligent in their pursuit of these stories, these histories, these oral traditions, and have sought to reintegrate nomadic peoples into the stories of global history, where they properly belong. In fact, we'll see in these lectures that comprise the last part of our course just how integral nomadic peoples have been in the construction of the modern world. And we start here with raiders and rivals of the northern steppes. North and west of China spread the northern steppes of Asia, the land on the other side of the Great Wall, you might say, where the historical home of the tribal nomadic peoples known as the Mongols and the Turks. The Mongols and the Turks are two groups loosely knit, comprised of clans and family units, knitted occasionally into larger tribal and even imperial units. The Mongols and the Turks were hunters, herdsmen, and horsemen of the northern steppes, a region that did not support farming, and which in any case these nomadic peoples chose to have little to do with the more sedentary pursuits of the farmer and his field. Mongols and Turks, as I say, were knitted together loosely in a language family known as Altaic. Altaic, so called because centered in Asia, Central Asia, and Northeast Asia, were the Altai Mountains, home to various Russian, Mongolian, and Chinese peoples and boundaries that come together in history. And woven into this region were the Turkic, Mongolian, and Tungus tribal peoples, that is, nomadic pastoral tribal peoples, whose history would come to comprise some of the great developments in the modern era of global history. What kind of people were these nomadic peoples? Well, tough and resilient, as you might guess, from their environment. The northern steppes can be very forbidding, a harsh environment, terribly cold in the winter, bitterly hot in the summer. And without the advantages of great timber regions, they lived from the materials at hand, the skins of their animals, everything from the hides to the internal organs, the bones, the sinews. Almost nothing was wasted, as these herders and horsemen learned how to perfect the art of using what their environment gave them. They were also masters of what historians call steppe cavalry warfare, that is, mounted on horseback. They were expert archers, expert raiders, often hitting and running from the civilizations they encountered. As Strayer describes it, what enabled pastoral peoples to make their most visible entry onto the stage of history was the military potential of horseback riding and of camel riding somewhat later. Their mastery of mounted warfare made possible a long but intermittent series of nomadic empires across the steppes of Inner Asia and elsewhere. For 2,000 years, those states played a major role in Eurasian history and represented a standing challenge to and influence upon the agrarian civilizations of their borders. Yes, the agrarian civilizations, the sedentary farmer folk with whom the nomads often had interaction, not always peaceful, but interaction nonetheless. These are the people who built their empires from the saddle. And among the first of these great empires, the great Seljuk Empire, a Turkic dynasty that ruled much of Central Asia, the Middle East, and Anatolia from around 1037 to 1194. The Seljuks were a great clan that developed into an empire. And among their greatest leaders, commanders, and ultimately emperors was the Sultan Alp Arslan, ruler of the Seljuk dynasty. Yes, Sultan was a term the Turks had borrowed, an Arab term the Turks had borrowed to represent great dynastic leader, the Sultan Alp Arslan. One of the things that made the Seljuks so formidable was their blending of their northern steppe traditions with the sedentary civilizations, the traditions of the sedentary civilizations of Central Asia, and in particular the conversion to Islam. The Turks, for the first time in their history, beginning in the 800s and 900s, will convert to Islam and thus enjoy a connection across the Islamic domain, the Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, that will benefit them in various ways through wealth and marriage, will give these northern steppe raiders and riders a kind of legitimacy, you might say, now as defenders of Islam, a legitimacy in the eyes of the settled civilizations. While another tribal branch, not the Seljuks, but another tribal branch of the Turks, seized control of the Anatolian city of Bursa in 1326, and from there forged the basis of a new Turkic dynasty named for the Sultan of these Turks, Uthman. This dynasty would come to be known as the Ottoman dynasty. And there you see the tugra, or signature, of the Ottoman Turk Orhan, a grandson of Uthman. The builders of the Ottoman dynasty. Evident here in the architecture of what had been a Greek city, Bursa in Anatolia, now blending in the familiar mosque architecture and Arabic writing, calligraphy writing, along with the unique stylings of the Turks themselves, as they settle into their role as rulers of Anatolia. The Ottomans will forge a dynasty that will last until the 20th century and create the basis for what is the modern state of Turkey today. And the ultimate prize for the Ottoman dynasts was the ancient Greco-Roman city at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, the crossroads of East and West, the city named for the Roman Emperor Constantine, the city of Constantinople, the great fortified metropolis on the crossroads of Europe and Asia, or as the Turks knew it, Rum. In their Turkic language, Rum, meaning the great city of who? The Roman emperors. And so it was the mantle of the Romans that the Ottoman Turks will now attempt to seize, hoping to bestow on themselves the great prestige, the great legitimacy that the Roman Empire had always laid claim to in that part of the world. But taking the city of Constantinople would be no easy feat. For 800 years, the city remained defended and protected by its great walls, resisting the efforts of all would-be raiders and robbers to breach. And here it was the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed, the great-great-great-grandson of Uthman, the dynasty founder, who would lay plans to take the great city by combining the technologies and warfare styles of the Eurasian continent into a single, irresistible force, ushering now a new age in warfare, an age of gunpowder, exploiting the developing technology of his age. The Sultan Mehmed was fully Turkic, but he was actually born on the European side of the Bosphorus Sea, as his ancestors had laid claim to lands on the European side of the continent, where he was born and raised with Greek tutors and teachers. He learned about the great Alexander the Great, the great Greek emperor, the young Greek emperor Alexander, and he wanted to fashion himself in that epic storytelling tradition. And so taking Constantinople with the great cannons that his gunsmiths forged for him, firing these cannons, using the recipe of Chinese gunpowder technology, the metal casting of European metalsmiths, the granite of the Black Sea region forged into great cannonball projectiles and ordnance. For 54 days, 69 guns firing for 54 days at the walls of Constantinople until they began to crumble into dust. It was a new chapter in globalization. The Turks taking Constantinople, a city that would come to be known now as Istanbul, the world's greatest Christian cathedral, transformed into an Islamic mosque with its great minarets positioned like the swords of Islam now around this ancient Christian and now Islamic edifice. It was this blending of East and West, of Greek and Turkic, of Roman Christian and Greek Orthodox and Islamic religions, this crossroads city, a perfect blend now for a new global age. And a whole world of trade opening up. And I like this map especially because it shows the overlapping spheres of trade from Northern Europe and Central Europe to North Africa, overlapping with the great trade routes of the Mediterranean. This is what we call a relay of global trade. No single trade route, not even the Great Silk Road trade, as you see here, can command by itself this entire vast region of Afro-Eurasian and Indian Ocean trading routes. But regional trades, overlapping with other regional trades, made trade goods and trade practices available over a huge territory. And centered here at Constantinople, one might argue now, with this new Turkic city, this new Istanbul, governed by the Ottoman Sultan, Islamic in religion, but cosmopolitan in its view, will this new Ottoman Empire sit roughly at a kind of geographical center of many of these trades and rise for the next 600 years as the preeminent power throughout much of the Mediterranean, Middle East, and North Africa. Not until after World War II will the Ottoman Empire be disassembled with its core left as the modern state of Turkey. Now, as we'll see in part 2 of this video lecture, it wasn't only the Turks that are doing the work of weaving together great trading and cultural zones of the world, but it was their Altaic cousins, the Mongols, who will also make a mighty contribution toward what we call the modern age of world history. So we'll come back in part 2 to talk about the Mongols.